Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome to another tank review, this time having a look at the Tier 6 French heavy tank, the ARL 44, as you can see here. This thing historically is a bit of an odd cookie. Essentially, when Paris was liberated towards the end of the Second World War, the French government decided to start work on a new tank for the French military. Now, the objective here wasn't really primarily to create a super duper tank that would be amazing or anything like that. It was more to regain the infrastructure and to retain the expertise within France in order to do this, because bear in mind, France as a nation had been occupied for a number of years now by Nazi Germany, and had kind of lost any indigenous tank production or arms production that they might once have had. And so the focus was very much on trying to regain, or at least start to regain, their position as a preeminent arms manufacturer. They didn't want to lose the skilled workforce, and so on and so forth. So the original proposal put forward was very conservative, actually. It only called for a tank that was around about 30 tons in weight, had around about 60mm of armour, and came with a 75mm gun. And so this was the idea that was originally bandied around for a while. It took a little while before the French military actually pointed out, well, what's the point of this? You know, the specs you've put forward are essentially the same for a Sherman, and we can go and get a Sherman down the road from the Americans, so why bother? And as a result, this thing was, the specifications for this design were upped, so that 60mm of armour became 120mm of armour. The weight allowance for the machine was increased, and also the gun that it would use was changed so that it would be using a more powerful gun. Unfortunately, in order to get a more powerful gun at the time, they were generally looking at, say, an American 76mm, or possibly, preferably, the British 17-pounder, but that was kind of at odds with the fact that the French wanted this to be an entirely indigenous design. They didn't want to be getting in any foreign components. One of the big problems, of course, had been that in order to make that work, they were having to use a number of outdated components on the tank. Again, French military production hadn't really been doing a great deal of much for ages, and so in order for the engineers to put this thing together, it was kind of based on and used components from much older designs, you know, going back to things like the Char B1. And so the suspension system, for example, was decidedly antiquated for its time. Nonetheless, eventually the French were able to get hold of a 90mm naval gun. I say get hold of. They were able to modify a 90mm naval gun for use in this tank, and suddenly you had an entirely French design using French components. And this thing was put into production, and it was only in the late 40s that really production of this tank was discontinued. But it is interesting to note that production of this tank was started and was continued despite the end of the Second World War and there no longer being a need, a military need anyway, for this machine. But it was continued because, again, the military use of the tank was never really the primary consideration. It was much more about France reasserting its ability to indigenously produce weapons and tanks, and about keeping the expertise within their nation, and so on and so forth. Don't forget that you rewind the clock 30 years, and France had been one of the preeminent international powers in the world, and one of the preeminent arms manufacturers, and they were right at the forefront of tank development along with the British. So that was a position they really wanted to regain. Anyway, enough of the history blurb. What is it that we actually have in game? Well, this is a Tier 6 heavy tank, which, yeah, that kind of feels about right for it, to be honest. The French tech tree is a little bit weird if you try and consider it in terms of chronology. If we have a look at the French heavy tanks here, you have some kind of mid-war trash in the lower tiers. The Char B1, oh sorry, some interwar trash. The Char B1 was the outbreak of the Second World War, probably the most advanced tank in the world, or one of the most effective. And then of course you've got the BDR G1B here, and then the ARL 44. This was, you know, put together, the design was put out in 1944, hence the designation. SHA B1 1939, and you can really see, even though this is still using ancient components, you can really see some of the changes that have happened during the war from one to the other. You then get the AMX M445, which of course was put together in 1945, and then you have the tanks from the 1950s, which are a very different tank design. Anyway, but if we just stay at the ARL 44 for now, and let's just have a look at some of the modules that you may or may not have already unlocked for this tank. First thing to note, as soon as you get into this machine, the stock gun on it, well, remember I said that they were looking at it using an American 76mm gun at one point. You have the M1A1 76mm gun. This is the gun that's used on the Sherman, M4 Sherman, for example. That's the stock gun. That'd be okay at tier 5, nothing special, but okay. At tier 6, it's really looking rather underwhelming. Fortunately, however, if you have any brain cells, you'll have unlocked this 90mm gun on the BDR at tier 5, so you have that to use as an interim solution. 240 alpha, 135 penetration. You don't want to use it any longer than you have to, but as a grinding gun, it will get the job done. Suspension and turret, of course, are unique to every tank, so you won't be able to start unlocking these guns because you won't have the turret. In terms of the engine, this is used on a whole raft of different tanks, but none of them are lower tiered than this machine. So unless you've already gone up, I think it's the tank destroyer line, yeah. Unless you've already gone up the French tank destroyer line to at least tier 7, you're not going to have this engine already unlocked, and you're going to be stuck with the stock engine, 575 horsepower there. The radio, in case anyone cares, is used on a whole raft of different tanks. But once again, unless you have gone down one of the other French tank lines, you won't have this unlocked, because this is the first heavy tank in the French tech tree that gets that particular radio, but you shouldn't be prioritising that. So what would I recommend when it comes to upgrading this tank? Well, I would say, whilst this 90mm gun is okay to be getting on with, the 135 penetration really is kind of low. And leaves a little bit to be desired, despite the fact that it has a slightly higher rate of fire than one of the later guns. Just the low penetration is a bit awkward. So what I would say is your first port of call wants to be the turret. Now, when I originally played this tank, yeah, that's fine. When I originally played this tank, it had a very different stock turret, and so when you upgraded to the new turret, you had a massive reduction in the tank's weight. Now, that is still true to a certain extent. There's a 500 kilo difference between the turrets in favour of the fully upgraded one, but that's not as extreme as it once was. What it does mean, however, is by getting this turret, not only do you, well, buff the tank in obvious ways, but you also make the tank lighter, which makes your life a little bit easier. So my priority would be 1, get the turret, 2, get this 90mm gun, the F3. Strictly speaking, you don't need to unlock any of these 3 guns to progress to the AMX M445, but if you try and get to the AMX M445 without unlocking any of these guns, you're an idiot. So don't do it. So get the 90mm F3 gun, then get the suspension and the engine and all that good stuff, and I guess the radio if you want, and then work on these top 2 guns. All of these 3 guns are options on this tank. They are perfectly viable options to use. There isn't really a top gun per se on the ARL 44, but we'll get to that in a bit. Firepower, like I said, I'm going to talk about that shortly. Survivability, this thing has 110mm of frontal turret armor, 120mm on the front of the hull. Those values are 30 and 60 from the side, and 30 and 40 from the rear. Sorry, that's 30 and 40, and sorry, that's 40 and 30. As in 40 on the hull, rear of the hull, 60 on the side of the hull, and 30 on the side and rear of the turret. We'll talk about more about the armour shortly, but just to say for now, the turret is not particularly well armoured. The front of the hull is not bad, and actually this is probably the thickest armour you're going to have on a French heavy tank up until about tier 9. In terms of hit points, 820 hit points is okay. It's sort of par for the course. It's nothing special at tier 6, but it gets the job done. Mobility, well, this is a sort of 46-ton tank with a 750 horsepower engine, giving it a surprisingly good specific power of 16 horsepower per ton. And the top speed in-game is limited at 37 kilometers an hour, which is interesting because historically the ARL couldn't really do more than about 30 kilometers an hour because of its dodgy, aged suspension. But in-game they've given you a bit more the benefit of the doubt for that one. 20.86 traverse speed for the hull is not very good. Now, of course, in reality, the actual traverse speed of the tank will depend on the ground resistances, the terrain you're on, the engine power, etc. But just to say, this thing, whilst mobility is not bad, it is quite sluggish to traverse. Concealment, who cares, it's a heavy tank. View range, 350 meters. For a tier 6 tank, that's just plain bad. The only way you're really going to be able to get anything out of this view range is by using binocular telescopes, and I don't recommend that. So you're probably going to have to live with having no view range. Signal range is fine, who cares? Let's have a look at these guns then. So there are 3 perfectly viable guns that you can use on the ARL 44. None of them is flat out better than the other. They all come with their various different pros and cons. Firstly, 90mm gun F3. 6.82 rounds a minute rate of fire, 170 pen, 240 alpha, 0.39 dispersion at 100 meters and a 2.9 second aim time. This is a very, very generic 90mm gun. It's very similar to the M3 90mm gun found on the American M6. It's very similar to the 90mm gun found on the Pershing, you know, the list goes on. This is a very generic gun. It's nothing special, but it's also not completely terrible in any particular way. The DPM, while not fantastic, gets the job done. The penetration gets the job done. The alpha damage gets the job done. You kind of get the idea. The reason I state that is because the other 2 guns, whilst they have features that are very definitely better than this F3, they also have some features that can be decidedly off-putting, and so if you don't like either of those, this is a perfectly usable gun. And this is actually the gun you're going to see me using in the replays because I don't actually like either of the other 2 weapons. But that's going to come down to personal preference a little bit. Then we have this 105mm gun, 5.61 rounds per minute rate of fire, 165 pen, 300 alpha, 0.41 dispersion and a 3.4 second aiming time. If you compare the guns, what you find is that the 105 has, well, okay, marginally less penetration, but who really cares? 170, 165, whatever. Has higher alpha damage, 300 compared to 240. And if you work out the DPM, I believe you find the DPM is also better on the 105. Can't be bothered to do it at the moment, but I believe you'll find the DPM is also better. However, it suffers from god-awful accuracy, 0.41, I mean, is worse than the already not very good 0.39 on the F3 gun, and this 3.4 second aim time is horrific, absolutely hideous to use. What you generally find is those people who use this gun fire an awful lot of premium ammunition, and there's a very good reason for that. With the premium ammunition, your penetration is 223, okay, fine, that's actually worse than the 90mm gun. However, your alpha damage is 10% higher than with your regular armor-piercing rounds. I have no idea why, but the APCR rounds from this 105mm gun have 330 alpha rather than 300. Suddenly you have very good DPM, very good alpha damage. Remember, this is still only tier 6. 223 pen is still very good. Okay, bad accuracy and aim time, but your good penetration will make up for that. And you just roll round corners, dirt people in the face, rinse and repeat. And you can do very, very well with that. Personally, I don't like firing lots and lots and lots of premium ammunition if I don't have to, because the machine certainly is not very profitable in that if you choose to do that. But also, I just could not get on with the accuracy and the aim time. They drove me around the bend. So that's the 105mm gun. Basically, a good gun if you're willing to fire premium rounds, still usable if you're not, but, you know, see what you think. Then you have the, well, it'd generally be considered the top gun, quote unquote, on this tank, the DCA-45, and this is a 90mm gun again, and this is a gun you're going to be using a lot in the French tech tree. So, what is the big selling point of this gun? Well, it is the most accurate gun just of all of the guns on the ARL 44, with 0.38 dispersion. Worth pointing out that's still not particularly good, but it is technically the best of any of them. 212 penetration, giving this thing the highest penetration for any tier 6 heavy tank gun. 212. If you want to fire some premium rounds, that goes up to 259. 240 alpha, it's a 90mm gun, that's absolutely fine. And then the two stats that ruin everything. 3.4 second aim time, same as the 105, which is hideous, and 6 rounds a minute rate of fire, which is considerably worse than the 6.82 you get with the F3. So basically, if you choose this top gun, you get better penetration and marginally better accuracy compared to the other 90mm gun, at the expense of lower DPM and a worse aim time. So, like I said, the 105 and the top, or the DCA 45 90mm gun, are more extreme guns. They have some good features and they have some terrible features. This is a more generic 90mm gun at tier 6. It's the one I ended up using, as I said, and it's the one you're going to see me use throughout the course of these replays, and this is what it looks like. The DCA 45 90mm is much longer, and the 105 is chunkier and doesn't have this muzzle brake on the end. So, what would I recommend in terms of modules and all that jazz? Well, nothing too surprising here. Bear in mind this is only a tier 6 machine, but even so, improved vents gives you an all-round buff to your tank. Large caliber tank gun rammer, very nice. And then probably, if we're going to be honest, an enhanced gun laying drive, because quite a few of those guns have god-awful aim times. And even the 2.9 second aim time on the F3 gun isn't fantastic. You might want to use binocular telescopes instead if you do want to actually have some view range on this tank. That's going to end up being up to you. Crew skills, 6th sense on your commander, safe stowage on your loader, repairs on everyone else, then brothers in arms, smooth ride, snapshot, all the good stuff. There's nothing particularly noteworthy about this tank when it comes to things like particular modules being prone to breaking. The only thing to bear in mind is that you have 10 degrees of gun depression with this tank, so there is a desire, shall we say, use that gun depression and go hull down. Just bear in mind your turret is not a small target and it's not very well armoured, so shots will go through your turret and you will lose crew members, your commander, your gunner, your loader, and that will make you rather sad. Ammunition, I've got 40 rounds of armor piercing, 5 each of APCR and high explosive. If you were using the 105 gun, you're probably going to be taking a lot more APCR. If you're using the long 90mm gun, you're probably going to be taking a lot less APCR, because you still have 212 pen with your regular armor piercing rounds. But there we go. I'll leave that up to you. I just have your standard set of 3 consumables there: med pack, first aid kit, med pack, repair kit, and a fire extinguisher. Obviously you could use something more fancy if you so wanted. You could take some coffee or whatever, but these consumables saw me fine, so they're the ones I have gone with. I think that's about everything I wanted to say, so let's go and have a look at the armor profile of this tank and then some gameplay. Just before we look at the armour then, one or two things I would like to quickly note. You shouldn't be too surprised to learn that there are fuel tanks towards the rear of this tank. I mean, it's pretty obvious where the engine is. No huge surprises there. What I would like to note, however, are ammo rack locations. So this tank has one ammo rack kind of in the centre of the hull here, and that's also true on the other side. And there's another ammo rack in the turret towards the rear of the turret on the left-hand side. So just over here is another ammo rack. So if you're looking to try and ammo rack this thing, that's kind of where you want to aim. Anyway, let's have a quick look at the armor profile of this tank. So from the rear, we have got 30mm on the rear of the turret. We have got 40mm on the rear of the hull, none of which are very good, and in fact some HE rounds might be able to penetrate there. From the side, 30mm on the side of the turret, and 50mm side of the hull. You do have this big fat suspension on the side of the tank. If you're angling this thing, it can make some difference, but don't expect miracles from it. Front of the hull, there is your 110 as promised. The gun mantlet can give you some more protection. There are also regions that's just an armor hole. Cupola up here that is 50mm thick. You do get some rounding on it, but it's going to struggle to get any decent armor thickness on there. These turret cheeks, they are 40 millimeters of armor or 30 millimeters of armor, depending on exactly which bit you hit. It is the side of the turret, angled back at 71 degrees. Don't expect to be penetrating those cheeks anytime soon, but if they do slightly angle the side of their turret, suddenly that's an easy penetration. In terms of the hull, lower front plate is only 51 millimeters thick, swept back at quite a steep angle. In fact, the angle is steeper than on the upper frontal plate. So unless the guy is cresting over a ridge toward you, the lower front plate isn't really a viable shot. The hull, 120 millimeters thick plus some angling, gives you around about 160 millimeters of effective armor. If the guy's angling his tank, optimally, if you will, let's try and get a little bit more on the side there. You can get kind of the side at an auto bounce angle and the front of the hull around about 160, 170 millimeters thick, which for tier 6 is not too shabby at all. But other bits of the armor, not so hot. It is of course worth noting that with 10 degrees of gun depression you can go hull down, in which case you are faced with that target. You can't really shoot it in the cupola anymore. The front of the turret is still around about 120, 130 millimeters thick, something around about there. The front of the hull suddenly becomes about 180, so a much harder target to shoot at. With all that said and done, let's go and have a quick look at some gameplay. So we find ourselves in a tier 6 match here on Fisherman's Bay. Top tier of course then, and this is one of these 5-7, not 5-7, 5-10 matchups. Anyway, the point is we've got 5 tier 6s on each team and then everyone else is tier 5. So we're not going to be shooting any tier 4 tanks, but that's fine. Going over towards the town, the city here, you don't really want to be too exposed in this tank. One point to note, with its terribly weak side armor, rear armor, roof armor, this tank does not take artillery very well at all. Now there aren't any artillery pieces in this particular match, but it's just something worth bearing in mind. If you can possibly avoid it, you do not want to get artied in this thing. Also, with the poor side armor, getting outflanked is a real problem, especially combined with the kinda dubious traverse speed. So that's something else you should probably bear in mind. So this is, as I said, the 90mm F3 gun. It's the gun I'm going to be using in both of these replays. 240 average damage, 170 average penetration with your armor piercing rounds. There's a... well, I thought it was going to be a Panzer IV, but it ended up being a Panzer T25. We put one shot into. The Panzer IV dies. You can see the bloom on this gun is... oh, I should say, it shouldn't say this gun. The bloom values on this tank are not fantastic. The gun does have a habit of blooming quite a lot. And so far, we have bounced one round from that Panzer IV, who is now dead, and even picked up a little bit of assistance damage on the Panzer IVH. So, not a terrible start to this game. Trying to advance through the town here then. Haven't really found any substantial opposition so far, but we'll see how that pans out. We know there's a VK over here. We do need to be a little worried about him, just because he has a bigger gun. That long 75mm gun can do quite a lot of damage. Well, let me rephrase. 150 penetration can certainly go through the front of my turret, so it's worth being aware of that. Another Panzer IVH pops his face around that corner and immediately wishes that he hadn't. But there we go. Come around the corner and I take one round from the T14. Where did he penetrate? Not quite sure. Second round is straight through the front of the turret, however. Now he is firing APCR, can't really blame him too much. He's got 125 odd penetration with his APCR, and that's able to go straight through the front of my turret. So yeah, that's a thing. He manages to put in another round before I reload. Was that also through the front of the turret? Probably, yeah, there we go. You can see, okay, he's firing APCR, but bear in mind the 120 odd penetration he gets with that gun would be towards the low end of a tier 5 heavy tank's penetration anyway. He just gets preferential matchmaking. The point I'm trying to make is that is the sort of thing you can expect from tier 5 heavy tanks. They will generally penetrate your turret without too much difficulty. Of the regular tier 5 heavy tanks, the one with the lowest penetration is, I think, the KV-1, and that has about 120 pen, so that would, which is about the same as what he was using against me, so that would be capable of going through my turret from. There's the VK3001D. We managed to put one round into him. Can we get off a second? Yes, we can. Ooh, nice damage roll there for 274. And this VK is looking decidedly unhealthy, and can't really blame him for backing off. Should also point out, by the way, in these two replays, I don't think my crew is particularly good in either one, in terms of their raw crew skill level. So do bear that in mind. Things like the reload time and the aim time and whatnot with a fully spec'd out crew would be slightly better. Another penetration received there, not quite sure where he managed to go through. I even looked there in-game, couldn't see anything. I'd expect the turret, but I could be wrong. M6 bounces that shot. He's using the 90mm gun, you can tell, because he bounced 240 damage off our armour, rather than the 115 or whatever it would be if he were using the stock gun. Fire again, low damage roll for 190, but we at least managed to penetrate him and put another round into a top tier tank. If these guys would shoot me in the hull, then I might be able to bounce something more, but as it is, I assume they're shooting me in the turret, which is a little bit odd, or a little bit frustrating. We've just lost our Churchill 3. I was going to push forward, as he seemed to be securing my flank, but his demise means that I'm not going to do that anymore, and that shot just whiffed. Not really sure where it ended up going. Oh, it looks like the M6 might be tracked. Unfortunately, we trade shots. Aha! And it looks like at some point, I'm not sure if it's the shot that was just fired, someone has put a shot right there through the track into the hull of my tank, which is a little bit sad, but there we go. So we're now down to 126 health. We put one more shell into the M6, repair our tracks because there was a leopard who poked his head around and did some damage to us, which is a little inconvenient. And it has gotten away from us, which is a bit of a shame. Someone else seems to have found him though, and hopefully, I think it's that KV-1. Hopefully the KV-1 will be able to finish him off, or I will. Track the leopard in place. And watch as no one finishes him off. Cromwell comes around the corner. We put one round into him. Unfortunately, the Cromwell puts a round into me, and I am dead. He's actually firing APCR, because why wouldn't he? You know, why would he actually bother engaging his brain when he's top tier and he'll pretty much penetrate anything with auto aim anyway? But you know, it's his credits, his choice, I guess. So there we go, that was the match. You can see our armor was we bounced some damage or some shots, but not a huge amount. When people shoot at your hull, you're going to bounce things. When people shoot at your turret, not so much. It's kind of the opposite of what you expect in most other tanks. Usually, the turret is the strong point and the hull is the weak point. Not so much in the ARL 44. Given that you have to expose your turret in order to shoot anyone, that is slightly irritating, but, you know, there we go. Just going to speed this along a little bit. Scoreline is now 13-8. Our team should be able to polish this off. The Cromwell Berlin has been taken down, and that just leaves this Panzer T25, who has managed to make it to the end of this match, and there we go, the game is over. So let's go and see how well we actually did. That was enough for First Class Mastery, Fire for Effect, Bruiser, High Caliber and Confederate medals, so not a bad run. 2,472 damage done, 1 kill, 1,045 base experience, managing to come at the top of either team by damage done. Well done also to our T-3485, 2,000 damage from him is a good game, and commiserations to the enemy M6, 1,400 damage from him wasn't quite enough to polish that game off, and the Cromwell Berlin, who was spamming premium ammunition at us, I say spamming, hit us with premium ammunition, he managed 690 damage. Ah, diddums. Never mind. 16 shots fired, 13 hits, 11 pens for that damage count. We received 21 hits. Bear in mind that's going to be slightly skewed by the fact that a leopard hit us with an autocannon. So, yeah, bear that in mind. 9 penetrated, 12 did not. 620 damage blocked by our armour in the end, which is okay. I mean, it means that we were able to block, you know, about sort of 75% of our hit points in damage, which isn't too shabby. 2 enemy vehicles spotted, 7 damaged, 1 destroyed, 587 assistance damage, and even with a standard account, a profit of 23,000 credits. Tier 6 is quite a profitable tier, after all. So that was a top tier game. Let's go and have a look at a bottom tier game now and give you an idea of how the tank performs in that scenario. Okay then, tier 8 match. It's only 3 top tiers we're dealing with. This is of course your 357 matchmaking setup. So tier 8 match here on Overlord, the Normandy map. So this isn't actually a terrible map for the ARL 44. You have positions where it's advantageous to have good gun depression, and the ARL has 10 degrees of gun depression, and that's a feature we didn't really get to see in the last game, and we might get to see a little bit in action here. Still, of course, bearing in mind the turret is not the best armoured turret in the world. So we are not going down to the beach, because the beach is for I don't know how to phrase that. The beach is not a good place to go on this map. Let's put it that way. It's like the valley on Lakeville or any of those other locations that is just a straight corridor between you and your enemies. It leaves you no room for outflanking, for manoeuvring. If you drive in there and find a bigger, scarier tank at the other end, you're screwed. And on both maps, this map and on Lakeville, you have the added benefit that that particular corridor in question, it's actually quite difficult to get down because of dodgy terrain and things like that. And even once you have, you find that it doesn't even give you the most advantageous positions on the map. So it's just not a good place to go. Instead, we're going up to the 9-0 lines over here. Now these sort of raised areas, these kind of ridge lines, give you something to work with to use that 10 degrees of gun depression and try and minimise the amount of your tank that you are exposing. Although we haven't actually really encountered anyone yet. And oh, speaking of which, hello Mr. Cromwell. We take the shot not fully aimed, but I thought he was going to drive out of our gun, out of our vision anyway. But as it is, we were able to put one shot into that Cromwell before he seems to get away. But he's lost most of his health in that engagement. He's taken away about half the health of our A43, but lost, as I say, most of his health in the process, so not a particularly good outcome for him. Pershing is over here. Our Pershing is moving forward and asking for some help, so we'll see what we can do. Sorry, the enemy Panther is over there, not Pershing. My apologies about that. I seem to be sneezing a lot lately. Still got this Cromwell over here. Can we possibly pick up the kill on him? Yes, we can. Jolly good. Puts us on the scoreboard with 1 kill. Panther is still over here, trying to give our Pershing friend a little bit of a hand against him. I mean, we have the higher tier tank here, that is true. But all the same, the more assistance we can give, the better. I don't necessarily just want to drive around there and expose my side, however, to anyone who might be in that top left-hand corner of the map. And as it is, our Pershing is able to take out the Panther without too much difficulty, so fair enough. Artillery is over to our right-hand side as we speak, or at least was last spotted up in A6, so assuming he hasn't moved too far, he might still be over there. The Oni has now gone to a better place, so we don't have to worry about him anymore, and the scoreline is 7-3. We seem to be in a fairly good position in this match. Take a bit of a blind shot. I'm not expecting that to have actually hit, but it's not as if the ammunition is particularly expensive, and I wasn't doing anything better anyway, so why the hell not, essentially. There is an 88. Okay. Nah, it doesn't look like we can get a shot on him from where we are, but if we can close the distance, we might be able to get behind him and generally ruin his day, which would be nice. So just pushing forwards with the rest of our team. We have just lost our Scorpion, unfortunately, to the enemy T-28 HTC. which is a bit of a bummer, but these things happen. Not going to worry too much about it. And rather than going after the doomed AT-8 and the artillery, I decide instead to lap around and try and help our allies versus the Scorpion and the Flat Panzer, etc. So let's just speed this along a little bit until I get into another engagement. And there is the Scorpion. Take a shot at him. Managed to pick up the kill. Just a nice cheap pickup there. Come across the Flat Panzer. It's possible he's going to drive around this corner, so let's see if we can ambush him as he does so. No. Okay. Oh, there he is. Now, this is an interesting engagement. We both have similar caliber guns. I have a turret, however, higher penetration and slightly higher alpha damage. He has way better DPM. But I managed to get the ambush off on him. So, yeah. And as it is, we don't pick up the kill. The T-34-85 manages to finish that Flat Panzer off. And that just leaves the T-34 now. We take one shot from him, and he is killed. And that is the game. So once again, let's just go and see how well that game ended up going for us. Second class mastery and fire for effect for that effort, though. It didn't feel like a particularly spectacular game, but when you've only got 800 and something health and you're hitting for 240 alpha damage each shot, it doesn't take too many shots until you've already done your own hit points in damage. So we actually finished third on our team in that particular game with 1014 damage, 2 kills and 702 base experience. Not too bad, especially when you consider that this was a tier 8 match. We're at the bottom of the feeding pool. 8 shots fired, 5 hits, 5 penetrations for that damage count. Most of it was from relatively close range. 3 hits received, 2 penned, 1 didn't. 220 damage blocked by our armour. We bounced one 88mm shell from the Flat Panzer. 3 enemy vehicles damaged, 2 of them destroyed, 191 assistance damage, and almost 2 kilometers travelled. A profit of over 11,000 credits, again with a standard account for that particular game. Only lasted about 5 minutes, so nothing too onerous there, and there is our experience. So not a bad result for a bottom tier match. Time to jump back into the garage and just round things off. Overall thoughts on this machine then, it's not bad. I used to like it more before they gave it a HD model. The turret used to be a little bit flatter and better at bouncing shots. They gave it a HD model and the turret has become an easier thing to penetrate, but to be fair to them, it is now closer to historical pictures of the ARL 44. So yeah, as I say, I used the short 90mm gun on it. It's up to you. It's alright, it's not fantastic. The only people I know of who tend to keep this machine are people who use the 105 and spam APCR. I don't personally like doing that, so it's not really for me. If you're not doing that, then it's kind of difficult for this thing to really make its mark. It's a kind of generic tier 6 heavy tank, and there isn't really much to say about it. It's not a keeper for me. I will be selling it. I used to think it would be a keeper way back when I first played it, but having since had the HD model put on this tank and come back to it, no, I don't think it is a keeper. Instead, my crew, well, you can see I've already moved the crew on. They've gone back into the AMX M445 to try and get an ace in that blasted thing. Yeah, but I'm not keeping this tank. I hope you guys found that review vaguely informative and interesting, enjoyed it, whatever. If you did, please feel free to catch some of my other videos and or subscribe to my channel. And as ever, I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao, ciao.